Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Often mystifying to many Westerners, the Buddha described these teachings as deep, hard to see, hard to realize, beyond the scope of reason, subtle. So I'm sure he'll explain more about that. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Joe, and welcome to everyone. And this is week 3 of a 4-week series entitled Reflections on No Self and Emptiness. So 2 weeks ago I spoke about the taste of freedom and the wisdom of the body. And last week I spoke about using the mind to free the mind. And this week we're going to move into the path of self-surrender and the path of self-discovery. But before we do that, we're going to do a couple of things. Which first is these were the practice commitments that I've been offering to this group at the end of each one of the classes. And at the end of last week's class, I put these two down here. This practice commitment, the suggested practice commitment to do nothing. And this is a similar practice commitment, which is a bit more kinesthetic, to go for a walk with no destination. So I was wondering if anyone either tried this and would like to share their experience, or even if you've thought about it aspirationally but didn't quite get around to it. That'd be really interesting to hear what that was like as well. So would anyone like to share anything? David?
Yeah, I tried to walk without a destination, but it seemed like every step is deliberate in a way, because you have to make a decision to take the next step. You got to make a decision to go straight or to turn. It was hard to go for a walk without having any purpose or deliberation.
Thank you. Jerry?
Gary. It was made a little bit easier for me to go for a walk with no destination, because I was in the middle of a huge upset with my husband, and I finally said, I need to go for a walk. And it was 11 o'clock at night, and I went out, and I ended up on a ridge above our complex, from which I turned around and saw that there was just enough fog over Visitation Valley and Candlestick Park, which we can see from where we live, that it reminded me of the set in the movie Peter Pan, with the fog coming in over London. And I was grateful, just amazed at the beauty of what I wandered onto, and the opportunity to just chill and go back and have a good conversation.
Thank you. Anyone else? And what is your name? Stefan.
Right after we left, I just walked up and down Mission Street and I wasn't really thinking of where I was terminating, but just observing as I went along, and that was kind of the way I was approaching it. It was kind of like, since I wasn't going anywhere, I was just going to observe my surroundings as I went. And I noticed, there's a Pentecostal church right here. I said, that's unusual. But anyway, and so I just kind of proceeded to go a couple blocks, turn around and come back a couple blocks. But I don't know if that was having a destination or not, but...
Yeah. It's really up to each of us to decide what that means and just to explore that and just to really get curious about what's going on there. So really what's behind these two practice commitments is this idea of moving into a more open dimension of being, relating to our experience in a way that is a little different than the way we normally go about our business. And it's actually moving into or moving towards this process of self-surrendering. So in terms of self-surrendering, let's see. So I wanted to come back to this little chart here, which I put up last week. And on the left are the three great phases or developments of Buddhism, which unfolded chronologically. The first at the top being the Theravadan, and that was followed by the Mahayana, and that was followed by the Vajrayana. And to the right, next to Theravadan, I've written, it's kind of attempting to just very pithily capture the path that's being described. And again, this is just one way of looking at it. So with the Theravadan, I wrote down it's the path of self-development or self-discipline. And for the Mahayana, we actually make the transition into a path of self-surrender. And then when we progress into the Vajrayana, we enter into the realm of self-discovery. So I added a couple little questions there under self-surrender, Mahayana, the path of self-surrender. The first question is, surrender what? What is being surrendered? And in this case, it is the story of me, the circus in my mind, all the stuff in our heads that just creates all this anxiety and stress and frustration and suffering. Our way of relating to the world that does that tends to contract us. And then the second question is the other side of that coin. Surrender into what? So when we actually surrender the self, well, what does that look like? Which now we get into quite deep terrain, quite deep waters. We enter into what is being pointed at by this rather mysterious word of emptiness. And emptiness, again, it's very subtle, it's hard to understand. And perhaps it's not best to approach emptiness with our cognitive faculties, because it is so subtle, so hard to understand. So we actually need to enter into, or it's quite helpful to move into shunyata, or emptiness, with a more holistic approach, rather than with only our cognitive minds, to actually enter into it through with our hearts, our minds, our hearts, and our bodies. There's some other way of moving into emptiness that is actually quite accessible. And this way of entering Zen is through the imagination, through the realm of archetypes, of symbols, of poetry, of beauty. So I'm actually going to read a poem, and I'd just like to invite each of us to listen with our heads and our hearts and our bodies. So this is a poem called Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Right, so last week, Michael asked a question about the unconscious. If I could say something about the unconscious. And I'm actually not going to say a whole lot about the unconscious, nothing technical. I'm actually a big fan of Carl Jung, who said quite a bit about the unconscious. And the way that I like to work with the unconscious is just with a simple little slogan, There is more here than meets the eye. There's more going on here than meets the eye. Or another way to say this, whatever is happening, and there's so much more. Whatever we think is happening, there is so much more going on. So in my mind, in my opinion, this idea of the consciousness is just a placeholder for that which is beyond our ability to see in our present state from where we stand. But there is this incredible depth to the mind. There's this incredible depth to our experience that according to the Buddhist tradition, this depth is infinite. It has no limits. Our ability to be compassionate, be kind, to be altruistic, to be calm and understanding, this capacity is infinite according to the Buddhist tradition. So it's the same thing, it's a placeholder. It's the unconscious. So in terms of this question that Clint asked, how do we see what we cannot see? How can we become conscious of that which we are unconscious of? It's very interesting questions. How do we go about doing this? And actually, Carl Jung has a tremendous amount to say about this topic. And when we start talking about wisdom that is beyond words, well, you really can't talk about wisdom that is beyond words. So there needs to be some sort of intermediary that allows us to just keep this in our minds, that there is something that is beyond words. There is something there that's beyond our ability to see. And these placeholders are what Jung calls symbols or archetypes. So symbols, archetypes, the archetypal realm, myth, these are all pointers. They're placeholders. They are doorways into a much more open dimension of being, into something much more mysterious. Poetry can be like this as well. When we read poems and we really listen to them and we create some space in our minds and our hearts to really take them in and allow poetry to touch us more deeply, this too can have a similar effect of just opening us into something that's much more expansive, much more intuitive, much more, I like to call it listening with the heart rather than listening with the head. Or even more interesting, I like to call it listening with the body. We can listen with our bodies. So the imagination, this imaginal realm, is very well depicted in the Mahayana. And as a matter of fact, it's quite bizarre what is being described in the Mahayana tradition. So if you've ever read a Mahayana sutta, you will find all this phantasmagorical craziness that goes on. The Buddha will be about to give a sermon, and all of a sudden, all these devas and gods and rakshas and all these other beings from other dimensions, beings from other realms appear. The Buddha will transport himself to various heavens, and he will preach to these other realms, to these heavenly celestial beings. Or you'll get these images where all these other Buddhas from all the different times and spaces will show up, hundreds and thousands. It's very bizarre stuff. And actually, I find that kind of stuff quite hard to relate to, because it is so incredibly foreign. But there is something really valuable being pointed at. And I'd like to explore this with all of you today. So the imagination, it's really interesting. Why is the imagination so valuable? Like, what's going on with all this archetypal stuff? Obviously, it's playing a very central role in what's being described here in the Buddhist tradition. Well, one incredible valuable aspect of the imagination is that the imagination, it really speaks to the heart. Really speaks to the heart. We can communicate things with our imaginations in ways that go a lot deeper. So I'd like to give you an example from my own experience. So I work as a mechanical engineer in a Silicon Valley high-tech company. And it can be a very, very stressful environment. The project that I'm working on right now, it is way understaffed, and there's all this activity that's unplanned. It's just par for the course, to be perfectly honest with you. But it's just really out of control. So I've been talking with people about this, voicing my concerns about staffing, about look at all this stuff and our milestones. And I've noticed as I complain about this, it feels like it doesn't have much traction. It almost feels like I'm crying wolf. So I took another approach. I added this image, this imaginative image. It's a metaphor. I would do my complaining. Then I would say to people, you know what this feels like? This feels like I'm in a leaky boat. I'm bailing water in a leaky boat, and nobody's fixing the leaks. And I noticed when I would say this, people would pause and look at me and really take in what I was saying. So I was communicating through this image of bailing water in a leaky boat. Now, of course, this is the imagination. It's a metaphor. I'm not literally talking about a leaky boat bailing water. It's just a way of speaking that actually engages the heart. Because it's so clear that this is not a cognitive exercise. I'm not giving people a riddle to try and figure out with their heads. I'm actually speaking from my heart to their heart in an image. So all of these symbols that Jung is referring to, that the Mahayana is referring to, are attempting to do the same. They're trying to communicate something deeper. So images can speak to the heart, go right to the depth of the matter. Images, the imagination, can also shift our consciousness, just like that. The imagination. So last week I spoke about the story of my friend Ron, the recovering alcoholic, and his response to road rage when someone cuts him off on the freeway. And his response to this, when he catches himself in a state of anger, is he will say to himself, "Oh, give the guy a break. The liquor store is about to close." This is an act of imagination. Just simply by bringing this idea to mind that the liquor store is about to close. It's very helpful. It creates this empathetic response. And it's completely made up. There's no basis of reality about it. And even to ask the question of, oh, is this true? The question doesn't even make sense. It's clearly helpful. It's clearly efficacious. So the imagination can help us to shift our consciousness. So, So I'd like to share with you a little practice story of one of the ways in which I like to relate to the Buddhist teachings in a much more imaginative way. There's this one expression, this little turn of phrase that occurs repeatedly in the Pali Canon. Is the Buddha will be giving a teaching, various places, and he will give a teaching, and then he will repeat this stanza of this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. This little turn of phrase keeps repeating itself throughout the Pali Canon. And basically what this is pointing at, in modern parlance, is just let go. Just don't take things so personally. Don't get so bent out of shape. Everything's fine. Everything's not fine, and everything is fine. Stay calm and carry on. That sort of thing. So I read this one story in the Pali Canon where in the appendix, it's in the Majjhima Nikaya. It's lovely actually going into the Majjhima Nikaya and reading the little back, the notes in the back, because there's all these little stories in there. So there's this one story where the Buddha is with his son Rahula, who became a monk. When Rahula became of age, the Buddha accepted his son Rahula into the order. And the two of them used to go out for alms together. They used to go begging for food. So there's this one story in the Pali Canon where Rahula is walking behind the Buddha, his father, going out for alms. And Rahula looks up at his father. And Rahula thinks to himself, wow, my father is the Buddha. He looks so beautiful in his robes. I look so beautiful in my robes. We're out begging. He basically thinks to himself, how cool is that? This is the bomb. Right? So the Buddha reads Rahula's mind. That'd be a little awkward. Reads his mind. And he turns to Rahula and he admonishes Rahula for this thinking. And he gives him a teaching. He gives him a teaching about the impermanent nature, the insubstantial nature of the six elements. And he goes through this, and then he repeats to them. After each stanza, he'll say, a wise individual knows that this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. And I was so struck by this story of, because this is one of my mind streams, my habitual patterns of the mind, where I will have this, I will call it the Danadasa highlight reel. Right? In the postgame, it's the Danadasa highlight reel, where I will sometimes sit and I'll just imagine myself, or actually reflect upon things I've done in the past, thinking to myself, wow, look at me. I gave a talk at GBF and everybody loves me and blah, 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 blah. I can get into this ego inflation. I can also go the other way as well, being really overcritical. Thinking, oh, I sure screwed that up. Oh, I'm such an idiot. Blah. It goes both ways. I tend to swing towards ego inflation. And when this arises in my mind, when this invades the mind and remains, these negative mental states, I will imagine myself being in the presence of the Buddha, walking behind the Buddha, and I will imagine the Buddha reading my mind, being there right with me, and turning to me and saying this to me. Danadasa, you must remember, this is not mine. This I am not. Remember. So we can engage with the Buddhist teachings in a much more imaginative way that can actually bring the teachings to life. And this is in our imaginations. Let's see, so let's move into the Mahayana. So I'll say a little bit about my own practice, just a little bit. I'm going to say more next week about my practice. My practice within imaginal practice is very strongly perfumed by and informed by a Japanese Pure Land tradition, Buddhist tradition called Jodo Shinshu. And in this Pure Land tradition, what is taught is this. It's taught that the I is very unreliable. Actually, let me back up and come back to this, around this. So around this Theravada approach of self-development and self-discipline, what I spoke about last week was that we will come across in the Pali Canon a lot of language that around restraint. One must restrain the mind. One must act with discipline. So when we approach practice in this way, in terms of self-development and self-discipline, this requires us to be able to discern what is helpful and what is unhelpful. And then this also requires us to have discipline, to apply effort, and then therefore we then need to make the right choice. So there's discernment, and there's also effort that's involved. And I know for myself that my ability to discern and my ability to bring the A game, it varies. It waxes and wanes. So sometimes I'm on top of things. Sometimes not so much. So if I am to exclusively rely upon myself, well, my judgment varies. It's not reliable. It's not reliable at all times and under all conditions. So here's a good time when my discernment tends to get a little fuzzy. Friday evening, after a long, hard week at work, perhaps I'm not making the best choices, but what's the big deal? What's the big deal? So it's very interesting, just noticing, how our own sense of ethical behavior, our own moral compass, just to tune into that. So now going back to the Pure Land tradition, what the Pure Land tradition says is that this I, what I want is completely immersed in greed, hatred, and delusion. Therefore, it is unreliable. So how can I, who am immersed in greed, hatred, and delusion, how can I liberate myself? It seems kind of doesn't make sense. And from this perspective, it does not make sense. And Shinran, the founder of this school, Shinran Shonin, what he used to like to say is, he would say, I am but a foolish being. Do not rely on me. Rather, rely on the grace of all the Buddhas. Rely upon the grace of all the Buddhas. That this is what is reliable. Now, in terms of relying on the grace of all the Buddhas, it's very easy for me to say. But in terms of how do we bring that into our experience? Do we want to, of course, is the first question. And if we do, how do we go about bringing this into our experience? And let's see, on the first week, David asked a question about cultural conditioning. So there's actually a lot of cultural conditioning that we need to be clear about. A lot of cultural conditioning tends to be quite unconscious, actually. We will take things on from our culture without noticing. And when we begin to examine some of these things that we've taken on, it's very interesting how things can unravel a bit. So, for example, I'll just put some words out there, and you can just notice how you respond to these words. Faith, devotion, surrendering to a higher power, so for some people are very receptive to this sort of language. I have a good friend of mine who, at times, when she will close her eyes, and she will just see angels, angels, angels. Some people are very open and receptive to this. But there's a lot of us who are actually quite skeptical of gods and Buddhas and what's going on with this. And that skepticism, it's actually quite widespread. And this does have to do with cultural conditioning, very much so. So here's a little mental exercise to illustrate this. And this example, it comes from a TED Talk by Elizabeth Gilbert. She gave this incredible TED Talk about genius. I forget the exact name of the talk. Actually, I'm going to talk about a different example, also from Elizabeth Gilbert, before I talk about that one. So Elizabeth Gilbert, she wrote, her most famous book is called Eat, Pray, Love. And in the last part, so Eat, Pray, Love, in the love part, she's in the country of Bali, or Indonesia. I'm sorry, she's in Indonesia. And she describes this ritual that she witnesses, where she's in this small village, and there's this belief in this village that babies, newborn babies, they should, if they're placed upon the ground during their first 6 months of birth, that there are these earth spirits who will come and kidnap the baby, take them away. So what they do in this village is, as soon as the baby's born, they do not let the baby ever touch the ground. And then when the baby becomes 6 months old, they do this little ritual where they make actually a little doll that looks like the baby. And they'll do this little ritual, and they will take this doll, and they will put this doll on the ground. And what they're doing is they're trying to trick these earth spirits to think that this doll is the baby. And then the earth spirits will come and take this doll, the spirit of this doll. And then once that happens, then it will become safe to be able to put this baby onto the ground. So this is a story that she tells. So now we can look at our response to this story. So I'll ask a simple question. Do you believe this? Do you think this is true? Some people will say, yeah, sure, why not? Other people will say, no, I don't know about that. And then there's also this voice as well. Oh, isn't that cute? Kind of looking down, like it's primitive. Oh, isn't that cute? Kind of condescending, kind of arrogant. There may be that voice that arises in your mind as well. So we can just notice whatever skepticism is arising. And now, let's play this little mental exercise. Imagine if you were born into this village, into this culture. Imagine if you were one of these people. Imagine as you were growing up as a child, you saw this ritual happen over and over and over again. And you asked your parents, what's going on? And they told you this story. And imagine entering into adulthood and conducting this ritual yourself. This is all that you know. You would have absolutely no reason to not believe it, because it's what everybody else believes. This is cultural conditioning. Right? So our cultural conditioning is also has very strongly influenced by scientific materialism. Prove it. Prove it. If you can't prove it, it doesn't exist. It's quite a common view. And coming out of this view is this what feels like a really important question of, is it real? Well, that's not real. Or, you can't prove it. You can't prove it. Show me the earth spirits. Show me proof. Else I'm not going to believe it. So this question of, is it real? Is it true? It's very interesting to begin to unpack this. And also to ask the question of, is this cultural conditioning? And does this limit me in any way? So this question of real, going back to my friend Ron and the liquor store closing early, well, that's clearly not factually accurate. Well, maybe it is, who knows? But this question of, is it real, doesn't really apply. So perhaps we could set this question of, is it real? Perhaps we could set it aside and go with a different question of, is it helpful? Is it helpful? So I'm not sure that it's helpful to believe that earth spirits will come and take babies away. So I don't find it helpful. It's interesting. So now here's the story from Eat, Pray, Love. I'm sorry, from Elizabeth Gilbert, from the TED Talk. From the TED Talk. And this... this has to do with to what degree are we really receptive to the grace of all the Buddhas? And to what degree are we skeptical about this? So in this TED Talk by Elizabeth Gilbert, she interviews this poet who's in her 90s, and her name is Ruth Stone. And she asked Ruth Stone, she asked her, so tell me about your creative process. And Ruth Stone, she says this. She says, well, I don't really write poems. Rather, I experience poems rushing towards me, as if it were like a wind rushing across the valley towards her. And when this happens, she needs to stop, grab a pen and pencil, and just write it down. So she tells this one incredible story where she was working in her garden, and she feels this sensation of a poem rushing towards her. So she stops, she goes running into the house to find a pen and paper, and the story is just rushing through the house. She grabs a pen and paper, and just she describes it. She says she grabbed the tail by its. She grabs the poem by its tail, and she pulled it back. And she said she wrote down this poem line by line in reverse order. It's a story she tells. So it's very interesting thinking about this story. Well, is that true? What's going on with that? Well, certainly that's not something you could prove. And actually, when we enter into the Mahayana, when we enter into this path of self-surrender, this idea of real, prove it, is it true, these questions no longer apply. And this question of having blind faith, oh, you just got to have faith, that also, in a way, it doesn't, it kind of applies. But there's a lot of things that sort of begin to become more fluid, more amorphous, more mysterious, if you will. So many great artists, many great musicians and composers, they will speak about this experience of their creative process. It's as if something is flowing through me, something is being communicated through me, that there is something divine, something mysterious, that I am just simply the channel of this. Something, do I believe this? So, I would now like to tie this all back to emptiness, to self-surrender. Surrender into what? I'm actually not going to answer this question. It's something for each of us to turn over in our minds. But certainly to surrender into something larger than ourselves, bigger than ourselves. So in terms of emptiness, everything is completely fluid. Nothing has no inherent existence independent of the mind. Nothing is real. This applies to everything. And when we notice our minds fixating on a particular way of looking, for example, no, I don't believe that. I don't believe in gods and worlds unseen, things like that. Yeah, fair enough. And it's very interesting just to play with these ideas, to play with the idea that, well, maybe gods and beings unseen do exist. Maybe. I don't know. Would that be helpful? To really open up the way that we think about our experience. Yeah. So I think that's all I'm going to say for now. And next week, actually, wait a second. I need to talk about one more thing, which is this path of self-discovery. Almost forgot about that. So when we enter into the path of self-surrender, we are surrendering ourselves. I'm surrendering what I want. I'm surrendering control. And just trusting in something else. Something that can flow through, something that can shine through. And this something can actually have the effect of dissolving the self. When we enter into the Vajrayana, I'll just briefly say something about this now. I'll talk about this more next week. Is the Vajrayana perspective is really interesting. In that the Vajrayana perspective is that, for example, in the Dzogchen tradition, which is a Tibetan tradition, they will speak about the innate purity of mind, that our minds are innately pure. It's just that there are these veils that have covered up our minds, this innate purity, and practice is just a matter of removing those veils, if you will, of discovering what is already there. So this approach is quite interesting in that it's a very good antidote to those of us who struggle with self-criticism. Right? I am my harshest critic. Pema Chögyam speaks about our inner drill sergeants. This voice inside of ourselves that constantly is beating us up, that thinks we're bad, that thinks we're no good. In this Vajrayana approach of self-discovery, the starting point is that we are innately good. We are innately pure. That this is our inheritance. It's just that we've forgotten. Somehow it's gotten covered up. And it's just something that we need to discover. So it's quite an interesting message there. Yeah. So in the interest of time, I'm going to stop here and say more about that next week. So I wanted to move on to practice commitments and then also open it up to questions and comments. So I added one new practice commitment down here. And this practice commitment is to perfume the mind. Perfume the mind. And here by mind, I'm not pointing at just our cognitive faculties. I'm pointing at something much more holistic. So perhaps to say perfume the body, heart, and mind. And one way of doing this is by the use of slogans. So I'm a big fan of slogans, using slogans to perfume the mind. And these slogans, they are very personal. And it's very important for each of us, if you choose to pursue this way of practicing, to find slogans that resonate with your own heart, with mine own heart. So these are just some slogans that resonate with me, so I just thought I'd share them with you. And these are very nice to memorize, to bring to mind frequently. Perhaps even to have a little timer on your phone that when it goes off, and have this written down on a piece of paper in your wallet. Every time your timer goes off, just to read it. Perhaps have it on your bedside table. But memorizing is a really, really good way to perfume the mind. So there's this quote from the Buddha: "This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself." And I learned this from a student in one of my intro classes. And she used this turn of phrase, which is pointing to the same thing. Not my circus, not my monkeys. I quite like that one. It's actually very good, that one, in terms of when you're interacting with another person and the conversation starts to go south. So, okay, which of these monkeys are mine, and which of these monkeys are not mine? And what's my business, what's not? Not my monkeys, not my circus. This one is actually something that I just discovered recently. With Amida Buddha, we can leave the past behind. Again, this is something very personal to me. And of course, any line of poetry that just resonates with you, that opens up. So this is the last line from that Mary Oliver poem that I read. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Yeah, so if we could just spend a few minutes with any questions or comments. And I realize it's almost 12. And what is your name?
Jason.
Jason.
I have 2 comments. So I felt a bit of a disconnect in regards to your use of the imaginal in relationship to Elizabeth Gilbert's story about the babies, and then saying it wasn't helpful for that, because how I view their ritual is the idea that, they're bonding with the child for that 6 months worth of time. So their use of these earth spirits creates a need to bond with the child, rather than having scientific studies that point to why babies need to be held. They have a ritual. Mm-hmm. And then I also just want to caution the use of the word great artists, because, who's to say culturally who's a great artist? Mm. And then how that can distance us from finding our own creative connection to the spirits.
Mm. Thank you, Jason. Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. Jeff.
It seems like, for some people I've known and identify as Buddhist, it's kind of a natural sequence of development in their practice to go from Theravada to Mahayana to something like Vajrayana, where there's a small self, surrender of the self, and a big mind. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I feel like I didn't do this description justice, so I'm going to come back to that next week.
Great.
But yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I got hung up last week on the idea of taking a walk without a destination, but because I was looking at it very literally, which is, I believe, a contradiction. But when I look back over the past week, for example, when I was making dinner, I was, in a way, watching myself doing the destination. Dinner happened, I had my dinner. But that was the walk, and I just observed it, and it had no destination. The observation had no destination. There was a purpose going on, but I was observing it, and somehow I feel that I was taking a walk without a destination by just observing what I needed to do, what had to get done. But I was doing it, but I was also observing it.
Thank you. Gary.
I have become a student of slogans because of the Lojong teachings in Tibetan Buddhism. And what I did with your assignment last week, many times during the week, I would say to myself, this story that I'm stuck in right now, do nothing, go nowhere, and take 3 deep breaths. And I would do that over and over, and it takes me out of my mind. I don't know. There's something happening that your phrase "perfuming the mind" reminds me of what's happening, and I appreciate it.
Joe.
I think what you were talking about today reminds me a little bit of. I had this teacher about 20 years ago, and it was a bunch of us were in this 3-week retreat, silent retreat, and the teacher was saying to us, and we're mostly in our 20s and 30s, and he was saying, me, my, and I are overrated concepts. It sort of reminds me of that. And the reason I mentioned that too is, like, I think when I was younger, my sense of self and the way of controlling the world was really important to me. And, taking a walk without a destination, or to me, as I get older, I notice, like, for example, when I dream, I don't label my dreams bad or good as much as I used to. In fact, I just surrender to them. And I notice even the so-called bad ones move because I'm less evaluative. So it's just I don't know. For me, it's a way of just embracing things more and making the me less important.
Thank you, Joe. David.
I was wondering whether you could talk more about being helpful, and how you would know.
Yeah, I will. Somebody 12?
Thank you very much. Do we have any announcements today?
Hi. I'm the host, so welcome everyone. There's some food out on the table out there. Help yourselves. There's tea, hot water for tea. You can just put your cups in the dishwasher beside the sink. There's, I think, a sign-up sheet on the credenza if you're on our list. And people meet around 12:30 and gather for lunch. We go out for lunch. And I think that's it.
And Mark will be walking around with the Dana bowl. And the Dana is very important. It's our opportunity to be generous to ourselves and to the Sangha. We do a lot of good work, including the Larkin Street dinner. I want to make a little announcement about November 18th is the Larkin Street Thanksgiving meal that we make for the homeless youth. It's sort of a special meal. We work hard on that day. I'll be there, and I think there's still some slots available for that meal. Just contact Clint about that. Or you can talk to me, and I'll talk to Clint if you don't know his information. But remember that Dhamma is important, and we suggest that you give 10, but whatever you can. It's good. Any other announcements?
Hi, I'd like to appeal to whoever is not going to the retreat next week. We have a need for a host. So if anybody could serve as a substitute host for that week, please talk to me. Ordinarily, it's not a problem to find somebody, but because so many people will be out of town next week, we're short somebody. So, yeah. do it would be greatly appreciated.
All right, let's gather for a closing.
By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow. And may all live in equanimity without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for your courage.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.